Good. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Kulud, for having me on board to give this rather short presentation about how to write a research proposal. It's a two-part series. Today, we'll be covering part one, which is the introduction and literature review. In case there are questions, I always said, and especially when I'm giving my lectures to my students, let's put them in the chat box. If you have an answer, you are free to go ahead and answer it. If there are some that will be pending, then we can discuss at the end of the presentation. As Kuluda said, my name is Munguti. I teach in Human Anatomy, University of Nairobi, and I love research. So today, what are we going to be studying? Then I'm going to put this away. So the objectives would be mainly to describe the structure of a research proposal, to describe how to write the research proposal, and especially the introduction and the main body of it, and to describe how to perform a review of literature and structure proposals literature review. And I've always said, if you do the work at the level of the proposal, then you will sit down and celebrate during the discussion of the research findings. This is usually the uphill task. And then once you go beyond that, it's usually the downward trend about it, as those of you might be aware about these two characters. So what is a research proposal? There are many scientific documents that if you are a student doing research as part of your qualifications, and especially for those who intercalate BSc, for example, in our department, but for sure in our masters going forward, then you do to write or interact with scientific documents. And a research proposal is the second in line of the many research documents you will come across. The first one being a concept note. Once you've written your concept note, which is the idea, is it possible, do you have a scientific question, then it will tell you to write a research proposal. If you do a research proposal, then the next thing will be the research itself, and maybe you'll produce a dissertation or a thesis. And at the tail end of it is a scientific publication, an article that most of us now interact with. But for you to get a research article publishable, or for you to be able to have a thesis or a dissertation that you can defend, then you need to go through this. And this scientific document you are calling a research proposal aims mainly at providing a detailed plan of the proposed research and routinely focuses on a particular research problem. Others will call it a research question that you want to try to answer. And in this research proposal, you should be able to see the practical ways in which this study will be conducted, so that we are able now to see, the methods are appropriate to answer this particular question based on some specific objectives that have been given. Furthermore, the research proposal will show you how the work fits into the chosen topic. For example, we have HIV/AIDS as a topic, but you might need to choose a topic a research work that suits, for example, nutrition in patients with advanced HIV disease, so that we know, yes, the global topic here is HIV. The problem seems to be there is a deficient knowledge in nutrition for people with advanced HIV disease. And therefore, maybe for you, you are concerned about what is the cause of this, or what has not been studied about the contributors to malnutrition in patients with HIV, advanced HIV disease. It also tells us what type of paradigm the research will add into existing literature. So that by the end of what I'm reading about, the introduction, for example, I should be able to know at the end of it, the journey has gotten to 95% of understanding the problem of malnutrition in advanced HIV disease. And therefore, this additional 1% so that you get to 96% is the subject of this study. Now, the structure of it, like this snake given here, we have an introduction. We shall go through that. Then we go to a background of the study. Then the literature review. Some will bring about the problem statements. Then the research aims and objectives. We'll also have the research questions. Most of the times comes before the research aims and objectives. And then we go to the scope and significance of that. So the first part of my talk will figure around here. The rest will come to be done on Thursday. However, I have to emphasize that this structure is not uniform, not cast on stone. Many researchers or many institutions or many funders of research will give you their preferred structure of their proposal, but most of the times it features or it entails a similar structure. What might change is where what is found where, but most of them will be where we are at. So what questions would a good proposal answer? If you've written a proposal, then at the back of my mind, there are questions I'll be eager, waiting to hear the answer. The most important one is there a research question? And what research question is this? Is it valid? Is it based on science? And for most of them who I've interacted with, I love that question. What is the science informing your research question? For example, going back to my earlier illustration, when we talk about malnutrition in people or patients with advanced HIV disease, what is the science? Is it chronic inflammation that is affecting the gut and therefore malabsorption? Or is it the frailty of the body so that this person is not able to go out and look for food? Or is it an issue of drug-food interactions? So that there is a thinking that you are telling us, by the way, this research question is there and has scientific basis and merit that needs to be followed up. By the time I'm reading your research proposal, and I want to remind us here, we are still not in the methodologies. We are still at the introduction, the literature review of the proposal. I should be able to know, by the way, what are the possible ways you are going to address the research question. So methods here are introduced. How are you going to determine, for example, malnutrition in this group of people? Is it BMI? Or is it waist circumference? Or is it the skin tag in the forearm or in the arm? Those things that have been used to assess malnutrition in this group of people should come up and say, this has been used and this was the finding. However, when this other method was used, these were the findings. And were these findings in tally or not? If they are not in tally, then why? If they are tallying, then which one is better? Which one is cheaper? Which one is more convenient for the researcher to use? How much time is required to conduct the research? Is it a cross-sectional study that you are proposing to do? So that you tell us at a particular point in time, if you meet this person, and assess their nutrition, then you give them a questionnaire, you are likely to get the causes of this. Or do you need to follow them up over a period of time? And is this time logical? For instance, if you are supposed to graduate in 6 months and you are proposing a study that will take, let's say, 2 years, is that logical? And those are the questions that I'll be waiting to hear. How much time is required? What are the expected expenses of the research? There are many ways in which you can use to assess kidney function, for example. In this patient with HIV chronic disease, you can use the creatinine to see how their kidneys are doing as an element of, to test whether they are able to synthesize erythropoietin, for example. Is the kidney function declining? Or you might decide to tell us you are going to use cystatin C, which is the gold standard, yes, but it's expensive. Or is it even locally available, that technology you want to tell us? So that tells us you've reviewed the method and said, even though previous scientists have used cystatin C to document the kidney function, this test is, however, unavailable locally, or it's expensive. And therefore, I'm going to use the simple creatinine, which is a routine test ordered for these patients. What are the possible results do you expect? Because you are not doing a research in a vacuum, you will find yourself being able actually to have an informed opinion about what you are likely to get. For example, if these patients have a poor social support, because previous research has found that, then what you are suggesting is maybe if you find a greater burden of malnutrition, then these patients are likely to have a poorer social support. And yours is to quantify, is it 50%? Is it 80%? If past research has said malnutrition was as high as 70%, but as low as 5%, but the range comes to around 57% or 34%, then you are likely to have an informed opinion and say, we are not sure, but we expect, or we might find this to be around this area because of 1, 2, and 3 reasons. How will you get these results? Again, the methodologies needs to be introduced and preferably reviewed so that we know the methods that are going to be used, because why they've been used before, these were their merits and these were their demerits, and therefore I am settling on this one method because of 1, 2, and 3 reasons. What new knowledge are you adding to us? That is the contributions that these results will add to the field. Remember, unless it's COVID, like when COVID came and we all had to scamper around trying to write new data about COVID. Research is never always in a vacuum. There is always something that is known. Yours is to add, or as you shall see later, take us to a different direction. And then the last thing is a question that I want, and this is mainly for papers that for funded research, is how will your research paper be helpful for whoever is paying for the methodologies and etc. for that work? So what are the parts of a literature, of a proposal? And before I go further, I need to remind us that, yes, there are types of research proposals. There could be solicited research, especially when here there's a call for a funding proposal, or unsolicited research. You are just a scientist, you want to grow yourself, and you are able to do a research. But as a professional, you can grab in it. So what is the parts of it? When you are writing a research proposal, then you'll come and find there are parts of it. And one of it is the introduction, which for me is the juiciest part. It's the best thing that you can write and that can make somebody stick to your work. Many people write it as the first. Personally, I write it as the last. I will do my literature research, I'll do everything. I have knowledge about the stats thing, and therefore I can almost always write my introduction offhand. And what is this introduction? What is the central research problem? We are talking about metabolic syndrome in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, a research I did before. The central problem there was metabolic syndrome in a group of patients with rheumatoid arthritis. That should essentially be like the opening statement. And why? It's not been quantified, yet these are patients at risk of hypertension, of diabetes, of dyslipidemia, of being overweight, of having an increased waist circumference. However, no one has been able to document this locally. And why is this important? Mortality in these patients is at a higher rate than the general population. And therefore, what do we need to know? We need to document what are the factors contributing to this burden locally. And therefore, that is what an introduction needs to sound like. You've given us the central research problem. You've pointed to us what is the question in a burst. Or what's the problem? What's the missing? Briefly, how are you going to tell us the purpose of your research? So if there is not known burden of metabolic syndrome in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, so what? We need to document it so that we know who is at risk. What are the factors that contribute to metabolic syndrome in these patients? And if we know that, then we might be able to know what can be controlled and what cannot be controlled. And as I say metabolic syndrome, then I have already said it's a group, it's 5 groups. It's a constellation of at least 3 of these 5. How do I get these 3? Then hypertension needs to be measured. How do we measure hypertension? Dyslipidemia needs to be assessed. How do we assess dyslipidemia? A greater than normal waist circumference needs to be determined. How do we do about that? And therefore, by the end of you reading the introduction, you know there will be blood pressure measuring done somewhere. There will be the weights and the heights of these patients so that we determine the BMI. There will be some blood collected so that we know the levels of lipids, for example. And why is the issue important? And to whom? To the patient. Yes, you have rheumatoid arthritis, and I need you to be able to check on what you eat, for instance, so that you control your diet. But more importantly, is the clinician. Are you able to take care of your patient? For example, hypertension. Which drugs are you going to prescribe so that you lower the risk of hypertension? So I've already identified the people who are going to be consumers of my findings. And this is what I'm calling the specific audience that I am getting. If I am doing a research in the variant anatomy of a particular vessel, then I'm targeting a surgeon somewhere, so that if you cut here, you are likely to meet an aberrant vessel. Those are the things that needs to come out in that 1.5 pages maximum of your introduction. Then there's the background and significance of section of the research proposal. And this we find mainly in, especially the new guidelines for UN have this. Traditionally, they were not there. International colleges have this, where the background and significance comes first before, instead of taking it back there. But what are you saying? You are restating the research problem, where you are providing a thorough explanation about the purpose of this study. Why do you need to do this study that you've stated in the introduction? Is it that we are having unnecessary mortality? in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Why? Because of cerebrovascular accidents? Yes. And therefore, if we sort this one out by improving their care, then you are likely to reduce this mortality. And that's what you expanded about. You present the rationale for the proposed study. What is the present scenario about the topic? That mortality in patients with rheumatoid arthritis is 4 times than in the general public. That's the scenario where we are at. So why do we need to do it? We need to quantify the burden of the risk factor for cardiovascular disease in these patients. And that's why we are saying, is the research worth doing? Yes, we need, so that we reduce mortality in these patients. And therefore, so what? Let's go ahead and look at the risk factors, especially the modifiable ones, that we can intervene in time and be able to reduce this risk to these patients. Then describe the major problems to be addressed by your research. The example I'm using, the 5 disease entities that entail metabolic syndrome, for example. I'm going to pick out hypertension. I'm going to pick out dyslipidemia. I'm going to pick out diabetes in these patients. I'm going to pick out waist circumference. I'm going to pick out those which are involved here. And therefore, I'm able now to address them early in advance. And then explain how you go about conducting your research. Briefly mention how those 5 elements, for instance, I'm going to pick. If you go back to our original example of malnutrition in advanced disease, then you know the things that you reviewed about socioeconomic status, for example. What is the marker of socioeconomic status? Low level of education, yes. Use of doing manual jobs or menial jobs, yes. Lack of social support, yes. And you are saying these have been determined as 1, 2, and 3. I've always told those I've worked with that there should be no surprises after you've written your research question, especially once the section where has, before you start saying this is the main objective, broad objective, specific objectives, everything there I should be knowing by the way the objective will be 1, 2, and 3. I should be able to know in the methodology I'll find how BP will be measured, how dyslipidemia will be determined, how diabetes will be determined, etc. Therefore, concluding about the background and significance, we are saying clearly identify the key or most relevant sources of research you intend to use. These are the people we call the authorities in a particular field. There's a guy who has written quite a lot about rheumatoid arthritis in Africa, such that every paper you research in the major journals, whether it's JAMA or Research, Lancet, you'll find his name there. He's done original research, he's done meta-analysis. So therefore, if you are to miss any of his publications, then the question comes, have you really done your research well? And therefore, the question that you're asking us, so once you identify them, is how do they contribute to your analysis of the topic? If there is more than one, are they in agreement or are they contradicting? And if they are in agreement, so what? What is the gap that is left? If they are contradicting, why? Is it the methodologies? Is it the different groups they were using? Is it the different timelines? Then you set the boundaries of your proposed research. What will be studied? In my original example of rheumatoid arthritis and metabolic syndrome, then we will confine our study to patients with rheumatoid arthritis and then those with metabolic syndrome. What we'll not study is the mechanisms of diseases, for example, or drug-drug interaction to contribute to metabolic syndrome, what we call delimitations, so that you confine your research to a particular field, and therefore I know at the specific objectives, you will not be going to touch a particular area much as I would wish, and you've already said why in the background. Provide clear definitions of key concepts and terms. For example, I defined for us what metabolic syndrome is: the presence of 3 or 5 of these 5 I've mentioned. If you have either of 1, 2, or 3 out of 5, you have metabolic syndrome. If you only have 2, then you do not have metabolic syndrome. Malnutrition in HIV is defined as severe malnutrition, let's say 30% of the cutoff. Then you already know that's the things that you're going to use. Diabetes type 1, if you are doing a research about diabetes type 1 in young adults, then you need to tell us what is the scientific definition of type 1 diabetes, so that we already know if somebody comes up with gestational diabetes, then that one does not fit in the definition of diabetes. So let's go now to the literature review. And the question we're asking ourselves is, what is this thing that we call literature review? What is it about? And this is mainly what have others written about the topic. Remember, I've said we do not do research in isolation. Even if any one of you was to decide to do a research about the origin of Ngoti, for example, you know that no one has ever written about Ngoti. If you just go to the government, they have an ID, and this ID has even up to the level of my sublocation. So you'll not be the first one. Maybe you'll be measuring the distance of my home village from the main road or from where the tarmac is. That is what the government doesn't have. And therefore, what others have written about your topic is very, very key. Now, your work is to tell us what is missing, or what was missed, or what was not covered, which means you've synthesized data, you've related topics, you've related numbers, you've related scientific arguments, and you are saying this has not been done. Or you are saying diabetes in 1990 in Kenya was 3%. Diabetes in Kenya in 2025 has been increasing, and now we are at around 8%, for instance. Then you are saying, what has changed between those 35 years, between then and now? People have already told you these changes have occurred. So you're asking what is missing, what has changed? Gum cutting in Ukambani, for example, is quite prevalent. You are saying in 0910, the prevalence was 14%. Now the prevalence is still 14%. Then you're asking yourself, what has not been done? What needs further exploration? And there's one thing that always excites me. It's not that we need to continue in the same direction. You could also be saying, by the way, this was not well looked at. And from the review of literature that I've met, should have been looked on the other direction. The great old debate of autism and vaccines, for instance. Is it genetic? Is it food? Why is it increasing locally, for instance? Those are the questions that now if somebody says, no, let's look. Why is it more prevalent in Kenya now than it was when we were growing up? Is it we are not recognizing it, or is it that it wasn't there? Those are the questions that literature review is about. And therefore, you are going to identify a research gap that you are trying to fill with the proposed research. We'll eventually ask ourselves, how long is long for this thing we are calling literature review? When I first wrote my first proposal back in 2009, it was a tall order to write a research proposal. How far? Because getting papers was semi-manual, semi-internet. But nowadays you can easily write a very long research proposal because Zotero and other machines, online machines have come so that one paper can easily generate for you 20. They are linked, the research rabbit thing. So how long? How do you safeguard yourself against that? So what is the purpose of a literature review? Why should we do the literature review? What purpose, what work does it do? And number one, you'll find that it provides a context for your research. You are telling us, this is where we are at. This is where I'm operating at. Harvesting grafts, for example. If you are doing the fibula graft, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm looking at vision loss in diabetic patients. That's the area I'm looking at. That's the context. And then once you get the context, as we read further, we'll realize you are telling us why is the research important. You are justifying the research. Why are we doing that? Why should we go ahead and do it? You're also ensuring that the proposed research has not been carried out by another person. And especially if you are honest. For those of, if you've done research or you've been looking for a topic for long, you always read the first 5, 10, 20 papers and you're like, yeah. Then out of nowhere, a paper comes out and just tells you, hey, what you are trying to say was done and has been lying somewhere and published, or even published in a funny journal somewhere. If you're honest enough, then the question is, oh, okay, I need to move on. But sometimes you need to justify why you are replicating the data. Why do you need to do it now? There's a paper out of gum cutting done around and published around 2010, 2011 in a hospital in Kangundo. Anyone can walk into Kangundo Hospital today, write a research proposal about gum cutting in that hospital and replicate that paper word for word and everything. What will change is the findings. And why? Because we want to see 2010 and today is 15 years. Has the practice changed? If yes, what was done to improve or reduce the rates of gum cutting? If no, then why and what needs to be done to do that? And therefore, chronological differences in research is allowed. If somebody did that same gum cutting in Kangundo, then you can also easily go and do it somewhere in Mwingi. And you are saying, yes, it is 2010 in Kangundo, a peri-urbanish place. Let's go deep into Kambani and see what even the more remote guys are doing. So the location can also tell you, let's duplicate this or replicate these findings. Then the purpose of the literature will also show us where the proposed research fits into the existing body of knowledge. I think I've belabored on that. And then enables the researcher to learn from previous theories on the subject. And those who've written a research proposal, you will agree with me that at the end of it, you come out better, more knowledgeable than many in that area. If, for example, you are to pick an area and do study about the branching of the radial artery, for example, by the time you finish with that, you really know much, a lot compared to even some experts in that area. And the more important thing is you might even get more recent data. Again, what's the purpose of a literature review? As I've said, you will tell us how, and especially the how, the subject has not been studied previously. Not the what. I put that how there very intentionally. Because what is already known, but maybe the methodologies are different. For example, if you are to get out of here and look at kidney disease among patients undergoing dialysis, and then you are using cystatin C, for instance, vis-a-vis creatinine, then the numbers might be very, very different. And then you might be able to inform us and tell us maybe the equivalent of creatinine levels of X. If you are to use cystatin C, you might need to reduce Y so that you match those numbers. You're also highlighting the flaws in previous research. What were the question marks? What were the things that were not done right or were not approached right? And what needed to be done, especially in the methodology. You are reviewing the methodology and saying, if this method was applied, would have given us better results because of 1, 2, and 3. What gaps have we found in the previous research so that we know this is what you want to do? And the work you do, if you do it, what additional knowledge and understanding are you going to bring to the field? And also helps to refine, refocus, or even move the topic in a new direction. Initially, and especially for this, if you are to propose something new, people will be very resistant, but you might be the one to change the world. For example, the guys who are celebrating the use of thalidomide in managing patients' morning sickness, and then a pediatrician notes, hey, these mothers with this drug having more of congenital birth defects. Then I would imagine the one who was saying this wonderful drug is giving us problems would have been like, what are you saying? There's a new current drug in the market and weight loss. We really do not know the long-term side effects, or we know and we are not shouting much about them. But maybe soon at time, somebody will come and say, hey, what's happening with these patients? And that new direction you are taking us into is what might be the point of your research. So what are the general parts of a literature review? Yes, it has an introduction, it has a body, it has a conclusion. But do I expect you to find a topic saying introduction in my literature review? No. Do I expect to find you talking about the body now? This is the main thing. No. Do I expect to find a topic telling me the conclusion is this? No. So it's not as distinct as this insect here that it has head, thorax, and abdomen. But when I start reading your literature review, the first paragraph beneath that big topic of literature review, if I was to take you back again to my topic of metabolic syndrome in rheumatoid arthritis, the first definition I want to hear is either the rheumatoid arthritis patients are at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease because of metabolic syndrome, or metabolic syndrome in rheumatoid arthritis has been known to be a trigger of early mortality in these patients. Why? Because of increased cardiovascular disease. So we've already known you are talking about. And then you tell us in that same paragraph or the second paragraph, it's why is this important? These mortalities attributable to metabolic syndrome could be reduced. Why? Because some of these components of metabolic syndrome are easily identifiable, easily treatable, or easily controllable. And we need now to define what is the burden of this in these patients. That should ideally be your first 2 paragraphs that tells us what we mix. Then the following paragraphs now will tell us what will look like the body. What is the current knowledge of metabolic syndrome in rheumatoid arthritis? Chronologically, used to be less recognized. Now it's more recognized. Earlier research reported lower figures. More recent research is finding higher figures. Why? Are these patients living longer? Maybe yes. Or are we identifying more patients? Maybe yes. And those are the things that you are digging deep into your literature search. And as you do that, you are comparing or even contrasting and connecting the various research pieces of research that has been found. For example, I will compare published data about metabolic syndrome among Caucasians, among the Asian populations, and among Africans. How do the numbers compare? Then I will compare nations of similar GDPs, economic power, US vis-a-vis Eastern Europe, Western Europe, for instance, US vis-a-vis Far East, Japan, China, South Korea. How do they look like? Then I will contrast those findings with what about Africa? We are reporting lower figures of metabolic syndrome among these patients. But we know the number of rheumatologists in Africa is less compared to the West. We also know that the access to the medicines is less compared to the rest. We also know that patients' education and approach to lifestyle change is different in Africa than to the rest. But I might also pause and say, Southeast Asia has countries of comparable wealth to Africa. Oh, how do they compare? Then I go and look. So that aspect of mixing stuff and finding what was said where, how, comes in very, very important. Then while I'm looking at what people are defining as the cutoff for waist circumference, then I find the Caucasians are tall. And their waist circumference, if you are to apply it to Africans, then you'll miss a lot, because we tend to be skinnier than most people in the West. And if you are to use the values for the West, then they will not apply to Africans. Similarly, if you are to use the BMI standard for Caucasians, will not apply to Asians, the Japanese, for instance. So I'm saying, what about this? The methodologies. Do I need to use a different cutoff for waist circumference, for example? Oh, yes. So that by the time I'm even going to your methodologies, I know there was a lot of debate about waist circumference, and therefore I need to know this waist circumference is tailored for the African, for example. And once you've done that, then you need to summarize the works that you are reviewing. And summarizing of this work as you do all this is not duplicating the work they were saying. For example, I found a lot of this in one of my students where you find tables. Somebody puts a big table and says, so and so found this year, N was this, the percentage was this. Then you go to among Caucasians, you find a lot of papers summarized. What we are trying to say is, yes, when you're starting, you might do this, your teachers might force you to do this, but as you grow into this, you want you to synthesize the data and summarize it and contrast, compare, connect where needs to be done so that you are giving us a summary of and a synthesis of what you found. And then as you go towards the end of your literature review, then now we are looking at the last statements or the last two paragraphs, or the last paragraph is connecting this thing. And you are telling us now, based on the research that you've done, you are telling us the gaps are pointing at not quantifying the disease, for instance, and not knowing the risk factors, the predisposition to this disease. And you are saying why we need to do this. Therefore, this study needs to look into 1, 2, and 3 because of this. And going forward, since you've demonstrated all this, then what should be the next direction? Remember, as I've hinted before, there are ways you can look at this literature review. And this I found very important. Things, what is causing the different numbers that we are reporting about HIV in Baringo, HIV in Northeastern, HIV in Nyanza, HIV in towns along Mombasa Highway, for example. What are people saying? What is different about all this? Or it could be the difference of these numbers you are reporting was because somebody used a different method. For example, if I was to go to medical school and study the prevalence of overweight and obesity among medical school students, I could use BMI, and somebody else could use the waist circumference. And even today, the debate is this waist circumference standing or when you are lying down? Which is more important? And those are the things that we need to look at. The other thing that you might look at it is chronological. A study done in 1990 vis-a-vis 2000, vis-a-vis 2010, vis-a-vis 2020 will give different figures. And then you are saying in 2025, I need to do that and compare and see the trends. So those are the things that you'll be looking at. And even some of the authors you'll be reading their work, one published in 2010, another one published in 2015, and another one published in 2020. There is a trend. Is this trend increasing or is it decreasing or is it constant? And what do you think will be happening in 2025? So what are the key considerations when you are conducting the literature search? What must you look at? As I said earlier, who are the authorities in the given field? Those are the people who will be your key pillars, your morning star guiding you to the direction. How have they defined their key terms relevant to the topic? What we call being overweight has changed with time. BMI has stood for long, but we know that BMI is not now very acceptable. You could be tall, and because of your height, your kilos hide. Because of your height, the kilos hide that you're overweight. And if you were to do the waist circumference, then we will find you to be not in the best of a state. So those are the things that we need now to see. What are the current definitions? The authorities in nutrition, for example, what are they saying about BMI? What are the different theories that have been examined and applied to the topic? What methodologies have been used to study this topic? Have they changed with time? Are they available to you? Those of us who've done a lot of basic research using lab work, then you go and do research and find the Japanese are looking at the microDNAs or the mitochondria of the hepatocytes in regard to metabolic dysfunction, so liver disease. Then here you are busy documenting serological techniques. So those are two different things, and somebody might ignore one and look at the other. But those are the things that we need to be able to review. But summarize the results. If it's empirical articles, reporting data, numbers, and the like, summarize in a sentence or two in your own words. Is it more? Is it increasing with time, or is it reducing with time, or is the range wide? So that if 10 people have done a research and reported the prevalence of spoons falling off a table in a dinner table, one saying it's 1%, another one is saying 57%, then you not give us a table of all those guys. You just tell us it's a variant prevalence with range from 1 to 57%, but more commonly occurring at around 25 to 30%. If it's your review article, because some of the data we find, or some of the many things you find are from nice, wonderful review articles, then what are the main points that were brought about? Write down any limitations or gaps you notice. Are there contradictions? Please always note down. And carry with you that habit of noting down things. Don't trust your brain so much. Don't even trust the internet. You can easily look for something, find a paper. Tomorrow, if you don't download it or bookmark it, you find that paper, you can't really seem to find it. Or write that thought, and then you'll remember it. So what of previous research is important? Why are we insisting that cite guys? Look for those guys that are out there. It's because they had questions that they asked. Did these researchers answer those questions? Yes. If not, why? Or did their answer to that question they asked result in another question? And that is what you want to answer. What methods were used? Are they the most appropriate? Are they applicable to you? Are they available to you? Can you replicate those methods or can you modify? What was their key findings? And therefore, what do you need to add to their findings? What did they make of these findings? Much as many people have a tendency to is represent the finding. Whatever somebody found and attributed to is key that you might need to see, so that if you disagree with that attribution, then you might also have a reason to do your research. And what were the recommendations? So that did they recommend further research and that is why you want to do it? Or do they recommend we have at a stalemate and we need to move in a different direction? Where do we find these sources for literature review? What are the acceptable ones? The first two are important. Peer-reviewed journal articles, and there are different classes, quote unquote, of journals. If you quote JAMA vis-a-vis if you quote a local journal, somebody might incline towards the JAMA, but remember there's a lot of rich African data that never made it to some of these journals because they ask an equivalent of our salaries, if not an annual income, in article processing charges. But you know what to avoid are some of these predatory journals where people have published things that don't look very okay. Academic books, emphasis, edited academic books. You can quote Gray's Anatomy, standard for anatomy, for example. There is a standard textbook for internal medicine, Williams. So you can quote that textbook because they have reviewed, edited data. Articles in professional journals. There are those people who write about traveling, for example. You can find information from there and be able to quote it. And most of these channels, especially if they are online, they give you how to quote it, how to cite it. The other one is statistical data from government websites. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics here is a good instance. You can even go to counties. I don't know how much they cook their data, but if it's legit, you can quote that. Then you can also use website materials from professional associations. For example, if you are to go to the Kenya Association of Physicians portal or website, and you find that they hold their annual conferences every August, and that they have key speakers, then you can quote that, but use it sparingly and also very, very carefully. If you go to the American Association of Diabetes, for example, they have a lot of data and you can use that. But we are saying, be careful as you go to that. Not everything there is reviewed. That's what we are trying to say. So, what are the 5 C's, what people call the 5 C's of writing a literature review? The 5 C's of writing a literature review. The first thing is please cite. Please cite. And I always use this example. I know it's not, we were taught in nursery all the way to high school even maybe, that the sun rises from east and sets in west. And we all know it's not true, or it's not entirely true. And therefore, if you are trying to tell us that the sun rises from east or west, and then you quote somebody, then that's universal knowledge. It's like saying the aorta has 3 branches. The arch of the aorta has 3 branches. That's almost universal. But if the next statement you are saying is, however, data has shown that the pattern of branching of the aortic arch is different, that requires a citation. The sciatic nerve is the longest nerve in the body. That's almost universally accepted. I don't know whom you're going to quote for that. But saying that the branching pattern of the sciatic nerve changes or is not constant, that needs what? I said you need to compare. Compare data in comparable situations. Diabetes in US and diabetes in Canada can be compared. Diabetes in Kenya and diabetes in Uganda can be compared. But diabetes in Kenya and diabetes in Canada brings a contrast. Why? We have different educational status levels, we have different economic empowerments, we have different access to healthcare. And therefore, the findings you're going to find in those two can only be contrasted. But where there are comparisons, then we also need to see why we are comparing, why we are doing that. Then the other thing is critique. That's science. And I need to warn us that critiquing science needs an informed brain. You need to have the basis, the scientific basis of critiquing what you are saying. I've been singing about you are fat. If I call you fat, for example, the question will be, what are you using? If I'm short and plump, then I may appear plump because of my challenge in height. But you could also be very tall and fat, but because of your height, your weight lies to you. And this is what we find in most people who are tall. They get some funny stroke or cardiovascular accidents, and people are wondering what happened. Or you might find some very slim guys, and they claim they are not, uh, we are okay the way we are. But if we are to measure their blood pressure, then you'll find it's very, very high. So those are the things that you need to critique and be able to tell somebody. You might look very fit, but there is what we call lean metabolic associated fatty liver disease. And that's why at your age, you need to go and look at that. And then once you've done all these things, connect. What area of your research and investigation, how do they work? How do they come together? Where do they divert? And how do we need to change what needs to be changed? Then the question I promised you, when do you stop? And as I told you earlier, 15 years ago, it was a hard thing to write literature review because many journals used to print their things physically. And even there were no citation tools. Zotero and Mentley were not there. So you had to physically insert your citations physically. But today, because of technology, AI, and even the things like ChatGPT and Gemini, they can easily give you a very nice, wonderful literature review. But when do you stop? And I found these key guidelines to tell us when to stop. One, is there a repetition to conclusions or recommendations? You've gone through all these papers, they are all around the same time, all from different timelines, and they are all saying the same. Do we stop? Yes. There's nothing more you are going to add. Even the paper for July 2025 and the paper for December 2024 might be talking about the same. So avoid that temptation to continue adding your citations. Delimitations well defined. And I want to bring to our attention that delimitations is not the opposite of study limitations. The study limitations are those things that you have no control about, and therefore you are saying this might be the source of my bias, might be the source of not trustworthy results. By delimitations, you are saying, I set to do my study around this area, and therefore excluded myself from doing the rest. And those are the confines of your study, and you've justified them. Have you critiqued the methods and therefore told us, because of these reasons, this is the most appropriate method to use, and this is why it's applicable to my study? Yes. Then you don't need to go whining about other methods. And are the potential confounders and biases surmountable? Can you overcome them? Patient selection, for example. If you are to tell us that you are going to tell us the GCS scores of patients in ICU, for example, they will definitely be worse than those in the general ward. And therefore, if you are to report those as the GCS of patients in Kenyatta, for example, they will be very skewed data. And that's what you are going to use. Or if you are doing a study, you are a student and you are going to collect data from your friends. Why? Because the other guys hate on you or don't really like you. Then they will be biased, of course. Can you overcome that? Yes. By doing what? Going to collect data in a different class. Then, okay, let's go on. We don't need to continue reviewing. So in summary, what have we been saying? When you are writing your proposal and you are in that aspect before you get to your specific objectives and the methodologies, then please define your research question. Why? Because that tells you whether you need to explore the literature more and to scope it. Then you're determining whether to narrow or to broaden the focus. And then you identify your databases and the relevant terms. I'm happy the speaker before me talked about the databases. Determine your inclusion and exclusion criteria. It might come as a surprise for many of you. By the time I am in the methodology and I want to repeat myself what I tell my students, I don't want surprises. By the time I'm finishing with your literature review, I should be knowing why you are going to exclude HIV patients and patients with combined connective tissue diseases, for example, or cancer, if I am working on rheumatoid arthritis patients. Why? Because these are confounders. Chronic inflammatory diseases will most likely elevate your CRPs. And therefore, even though you might be having your rheumatoid arthritis, your CRP in this case might be increased, not because you are very sick, but because you have another disease. Choose the databases and then conduct your research. Your search. Has the topic been covered? Yes. Why do we need to do it then further? Because you've identified 1 or 2, 3 things. Who are the key authorities? You've known them. You've compared, you contrast, you critique, you connect. And then you tell us why and what direction we should take. Please, as you go about, review your results. Save the such results in a citation management tool. And this is where I bring about, I have a preference to Zotero. It's easy, it's nice, it's wonderful. I found people who die by mentally. Choose. Deduplicate your results, your search results. Most of you will be reading at your work and you'll find Munguti et al. 2020 and Munguti et al. 2020A. That A, confirm whether it's not the same guy you are trying to quote twice, so that you remove one. Synthesize the information gathered. Evaluate for strengths and weaknesses of individual sources. Look for bias, methodologies, and thoroughness. And then tell us what are your conclusions. Analyze the information gathered. Are there gaps in the literature? Yes. So what do we do about it? Tell us the methods you're going to use to answer those gaps. Where has significant research taken place? By whom? So if there is missing data locally, then you are telling us, I want to duplicate this research that was done elsewhere here. Is there consensus or debate? And do you want to be party to this debate so that you give us a way forward? And you tell us what methodological approaches work best. So that, and I want to repeat, methodological approaches in methods sections, as we shall be seeing on Thursday, God willing, is to detail how they will be done, not why. How, not why. If you start telling us why methods are being done in methodology section, then means the literature review wasn't done the best. And then write it. Write that literature review. For that topic you've been looking about, go ahead and write it. Pick an organizational structure depending on the ethics review board. For example, you are going to submit for ethical review, or even if the university wants you to do in a particular way. Always work about your citations, focus on your research question, and on the pertinent studies that must appear, and compile your references. Thank you so much for your time.